Hello, I'm Michael Marsh. Welcome to the program dedicated to reestablishing constitutional government, starting in Oregon, and then hopefully we'll spread the message to the nation as a whole. And my guest today is Daniel Dean Crowe, who is running for Attorney General. Now, if you want honest government, you need an honest Attorney General, because that's who has the job of keeping the government honest. Now, we were talking last time you were on the program about the fact that when the state decided to go after Oracle for not providing the services, well, they charged $200 million and nothing happened. Didn't seem right to many of us. The Attorney General, who heads the largest law firm in the state of Oregon, hired new people just for that case. And I'm wondering if something comes up where the state has to sue someone, are you going to be hiring people? Or, and I'm assuming that the law firm is probably a Portland law firm with ties to the Democratic Party.
Naturally.
Yeah. Will you be hiring people, or will you be handling the cases in-house?
Well, Michael, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. I wish that the loss in the Oracle case had only been $200 million. It was actually $300 million. And then on top of that, what was promised to be a $1.5 million legal fee for litigating this case is now up to $27 million. And that was promised to us by the Attorney General. This isn't going to cost us more than $1.5 million. Well, we're up to $27 million, which you know as well as I do means that we're going to end up at $40 million.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question about whether or not I would support outsourcing any kind of litigation, that's going to be dependent on a case-by-case basis, obviously. If there's some ultra-unique, specialized area that we would need to go outside of the Oregon Department of Justice, then we should. But this particular case, at least with the members of the Oregon Department of Justice with whom I've spoken, they were furious that that case was farmed out. And just to review the bidding, what we talked about last time, is this case was initially shopped up to the Oregon Department, or the U.S. Department of Justice. And the U.S. Department of Justice took a look at it and passed. And the reason why they passed is because there wasn't any there. So I would love to take the Attorney General's word for it, that there was some compelling reason to do so. But if there was a compelling reason to do so, then she should have shared that with us.
Yeah.
And particularly if she wanted to overcome our suspicion based on all of the other instances of incompetence, malfeasance, and corruption that she's turned a blind eye to in Oregon government over the last 4 years. She's lost the presumption of innocence. She's lost the benefit of the doubt. And so this particular case looks like it was solely to cover, it was pursued solely to cover Democrat backsides. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to go easy on anybody, because we're in the litigation, which means we don't prejudge anything. And when I become Attorney General, I'm going to drive a hard bargain to make sure that we get some fair settlement with Oracle, or we take it to the end. But I suspect strongly that most cases, this case, like most cases, can be settled. And it'll be settled based off of the facts. This show trial, and we've seen other show trials by this Attorney General. This show trial is purely for the consumption of voters and not for advancing justice.
Yeah. Now, this is going to be Law 101, this question. Define for the viewers what the word jurisdiction means in the court system.
So there's two kinds of jurisdiction under the law. There is personal jurisdiction and subject matter jurisdiction. And these two things have to be present in order for a court to have the power to hear a particular case. So when we talk about personal jurisdiction, as the name implies, we're talking about jurisdiction over that particular person. So, for instance, if somebody's contained or located in a different state, and we allege that they've committed a crime in Oregon, and they're located in Mississippi, for instance, then we're going to need to get personal jurisdiction of that person in order to proceed with litigation. Subject matter jurisdiction means whether the court has the competence of the area of the law in order to adjudicate this particular controversy. And a perfect example of that would be if we want to proceed forward in a bankruptcy action, well, we can't do that in a normal court. We can't do that in a state court. We're going to have to go to the federal bankruptcy court in order to litigate federal bankruptcies. So that's a specialized court. Or another example of that would be the Court of Admiralty. So we have courts of admiralty. We have federal courts who have competence over federal issues, and they can sometimes bring state issues in as well. But there's all sorts of requirements in order for a particular court to have authority to try a particular matter.
Okay, and the reason I ask this is because, okay, for instance, the gay marriage law. Okay, it was filed. A lawsuit was filed, and after people voted to make marriage man and woman heterosexual thing. A lawsuit was filed in the federal court, and I've read the 14th Amendment, and I'm wondering where they get the authority to even hear the case, much less make a ruling one way or the other. And same thing with, when states say, okay, we're not going to pay for abortions or whatever anymore. Where does the federal government get the authority to say, this is the way you're going to do it? I mean, sometimes there is a federal issue, but a lot of times I don't see a federal issue. Am I wrong, or?
Well, first of all, the question of how things get into federal court in this day and age, the answer to that is that all you need to do is find one federal judge who decides to make a federal issue of these things. And as we talked about last time I was here, we used to have a saying when I was growing up, don't make a federal case out of this. Those are for only the most serious cases. Well, we've seen an unbelievable proliferation of litigation in the federal courts. We've seen an explosion of it. And we've also seen a practice of federal courts increasingly asserting that they have some competence to try issues. Now, as a matter of policy, this is something that I'm very concerned about because I don't need the federal government, Oregon doesn't need the federal government to tell Oregon how to regulate the practice of medicine. Oregon doesn't need the federal government to tell us how to regulate criminal law. Oregon doesn't need the federal government to tell us how to do lots of things. We are a sovereign state, and we have the ability to manage our own affairs. And I think Oregon's done so with spectacular success over the years. Maybe not every policy I've agreed with, but certainly nothing so bad that we need the federal government to come down here and tell us how to live our lives. The federal government has a crucial role to play in our federal system, but it's as a co-equal source of authority, not as the emperor of Oregon. And there are certain things which have been delegated to the federal government, and everything that hasn't been delegated to the federal government has been reserved to the people in the states respectively. That's what the 10th Amendment to the Constitution stands for. And so the only way that I can explain it, or the easiest way that I think I can explain it to your audience, is that the Soviet Constitution had ample protections for all sorts of things. It's not necessarily the words that are written in a document that dictate how a government's going to behave. It's the degree to which that government actually obeys the words that are written in that document. Now, the federal Constitution says that the federal government doesn't have the police power, doesn't have the jurisdiction to come down to Oregon and tell us how to regulate education or how to provide education to our kids. And yet, with federal government, with federal money, always comes federal strings, and I think that's something that is a problem in Oregon today. it's not that we want to get rid of the federal government, and it's not that the federal government doesn't have a critical role to play. It's that the federal government has a role to play, the state government has a role to play, and interestingly enough, it's the Attorney General of all the officers in the state who is responsible for pushing back when the federal government overreaches. And that's a situation that, unfortunately, the incumbent Attorney General clearly doesn't have that same vision of the role of the Attorney General. Her vision of the Attorney General's job is to pass guidance from her federal masters down to the district attorneys and the sheriffs of our state. That's completely inconsistent with our traditions, our law, and the desires of Oregonians. So the federal government is not the ultimate source of all authority. The federal government is a source of authority, just like the Oregon Constitution is an important, critical source of authority.
Yeah, the reason I asked, okay, there's a movement by a lot of people that want to start using more of our natural resources. Mm-hmm. In fact, when Oregon was first created, there were state lands set aside specifically to pay the bills for the state. And they're not doing their job right now. But if they do start reusing, like trees can be cut and replanted, mm-hmm. there will be lawsuits, if we start doing this, and they will be in the federal courts. Would you defend the Oregon, or would you accept, would the federal government have jurisdiction in this case, federal courts, or would they not? Would you challenge that?
Well, with respect to lands that the federal government has ownership in right now, those matters, if we have a disagreement with the federal government about management of forest lands, we may end up in federal court and litigating that.
I'm talking about state lands, though.
Okay, and well, so with respect to management of Oregon lands, obviously the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution provides that there's something called the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution. And that clause stands for the proposition that when there is a conflict between federal law and state law, and when both laws are appropriate and constitutionally permissible, then the tie goes to the federal government because it is the supreme law of the land. The key distinction here is the assertion of power by the federal government constitutionally permissible? And so that's something that the Attorney General needs to hold the government to account, hold the federal government to account. By way of example, when I used to try courts-martial as a judge advocate, the way I always explained it when I was asked to serve or detailed to serve as a defense counsel was my job as a defense attorney at courts-martial was to make sure the government followed its own rules. In that same way, the Attorney General of Oregon, one of the primary responsibilities of the Attorney General is to make sure that the government, the federal government, is following its own rules. And when it isn't, then we need to call the federal government on that. And we see numerous examples. And if I may, I'd like to give you one example of completely nonsensical federal overreach for which this Attorney General's offered no relief. So there's a farmer down around Albany named Bill Case. And Bill has some fields along the Santiam River. And Bill had a problem with dirt subsiding into the Santiam River. They had some flooding. And so his field was getting washed into one of the rivers. So he went to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and said, hey, I want to shore up this bank here so that my whole field doesn't go into the water because it's going to destroy habitat for fish where they spawn and whatnot. And the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality gave him his blessing and said, okay, go out there and remediate this. He begins to remediate, and all of a sudden, the EPA shows up and says, what are you doing? And Bill explains, well, I've got permission from the DEQ, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, to mediate this situation. And the EPA said, we don't care. We're the EPA. And they fined him more than $70,000 a day for shoring up his own field. And the thing that is maddening about that is in a case in which a federal agency is abusing one of our people, you would expect, and I think any Oregonian would have the right to expect, that the Oregon Attorney General would stand up to bullying on the part of the federal government and push back. And yet, of course, and you won't be surprised to learn this, the Oregon Attorney General absolutely has been hands-off, as she has with so many challenges that Oregon has faced. And so this lack of advocacy for Oregon is exactly the opposite of what Oregon deserves. Oregon deserves somebody who's going to act as Oregon's lawyer, as our representative, Oregon's representative, to go to the federal government and try our cases and plead our case. Not the federal government's representative to the Oregon people. That's what the U.S. Attorney is for.
Yeah.
And that's been the problem with the tenure of the Oregon Attorney General, is she just hasn't stood up for the people of Oregon. And that's what I want to change, because I believe that Oregon deserves the most zealous, most enthusiastic representation that's humanly possible, and that's what I'm going to deliver.
Okay, now, Donald Trump got in trouble not too long ago because he mentioned the fact that a judge in a case that he's being sued in is a supporter of illegal aliens, and he worded it in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
but the reality is the guy does support illegal aliens being here, and he accused the judge of being biased.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that upset a lot of people in the Washington establishment.
Mm-hmm. I think it upset a lot more people than just people in the Washington establishment.
Yeah, but for those of us that have been paying attention, it's been suspected for a long time that a lot of judges do make their rulings based on their personal feelings rather than on the law itself. Mm-hmm. And for people that are paying attention, the judicial branch of the government is probably considered the most corrupt. How do you deal with this?
Well, there's a lot of things to unpack in that question. Let me say first that for a professional politician, Donald Trump is terrible, right? And I think we all know this. What Mr. Trump says, I hope and I believe that what Mr. Trump says isn't always what he meant to say.
He could have worded that a little better.
You could definitely word it a lot better. But on the other hand, our country and Oregon has had it up to here with professional politicians who parse their words and never say anything. So Mr. Trump's unapologetic focus on defending America and defending Americans and American jobs is refreshing. And I think it's a necessary part of the political conversation. Now, so let me say that about Mr. Trump. I'm running for Attorney General. The number one responsibility of the Oregon Attorney General is to bring balance under the law to the state of Oregon. When I am elected, one of the first things I'm going to do is go to the legislature and recommend that they amend ORS 180, which is the enabling statute that created the Oregon Attorney General position in the Oregon Department of Justice. I'm going to ask them to amend that to make the Oregon Attorney General's position a nonpartisan position, because justice is not a question of left or right; it's a question of right or wrong. So my opinion about Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton is that whichever one of them becomes president, when they push into Oregon and when they try to bully Oregon, I'll be standing there to push back, regardless of whether it's Mrs. Clinton or whether it's Mr. Trump. Now, to address your question about judges, it is deeply troubling to me that a couple of months ago, a federal judge was reported as saying, there is no reason for law students to study the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, because it's no longer relevant.
Yeah.
Well, it is the agreement that our people signed up to in 1859. And it is the agreement which we have faithfully honored for the entire time that we've been a state. I don't agree with the idea that the U.S. Constitution is irrelevant, nor do I agree with the idea that the Oregon Constitution is irrelevant. Judges are people, and the process by which judges come to their decisions is sometimes honorable, sometimes, and more often than not, I believe, judges have integrity and honor and honesty. I have seen judges, I have practiced before judges, whom I felt were putting a thumb on the scales of justice. Whether that was as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, as a legal aid attorney, in civil cases, in criminal cases, in Oregon, at the federal level, you very quickly figure out who the judges are who don't have integrity, and you try to litigate around them. I don't think that this particular federal judge, whom Mr. Trump took exception with, I don't think that that person lacks integrity. I haven't seen anything to support that proposition. Yes, there are bad judges. The real problem, I think, isn't that we have bad federal judges, or that we have bad congressmen, or bad senators, or bad members of the federal executive branch. The real problem is that we have consolidated so much power at the federal level, and we have stripped away the ability to operate independently from the state levels. So we are all beholden to the federal government. If the federal government cut off Oregon's education assistance, quote unquote, Oregon wouldn't be able to put its kids through school, right? That gives the federal government way too much leverage over Oregon.
Yeah.
And of course, the federal government being able to borrow effectively, I mean, as far as they're concerned, a limitless amount of money, gives them a lot more discretionary spending power than the Oregon legislature, which has to balance our budget. So there's a real, I think there's a real imbalance in the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. And unfortunately, the incumbent Attorney General has done nothing to address a balance. Quite the contrary, she's been complicit in further eroding the Oregon law. She's chosen not to defend it. She's sided with the federal government over Oregon, and she sided with favored constituencies over the enactments of the people of Oregon. And that's very troubling, and I think it's less than what Oregon deserves.
So, you know, there is definitely a lack of transparency in the government, but that is one of the jobs of the Attorney General, to keep everything honest in the government. How will you do that part of your job? How will you keep the government honest?
Well, Michael, I think, as you know, I served more than 20 years in the Army, and 2/3 of my military career I served as a judge advocate or a military lawyer. My background is the nonpartisan, non-political delivery of legal services for the public good. That's the environment in which I came up, in which I learned how to practice law. That's exactly the kind of integrity that I'm going to bring back to the Oregon Department of Justice. And by bringing that level of integrity and leadership back, we're going to take a very politicized Oregon Department of Justice with low morale because they're embarrassed about how politicized they've become. And we're going to return it to an Oregon Department of Justice that every one of those professional civil servants can be proud of. Right? So that's what we're going to deliver. There's a fundamentally different philosophy of what the role of the Attorney General is between Ellen Rosenblum, the incumbent Attorney General, and me. She believes that the Attorney General, the responsibility of the Attorney General is to serve her party and to serve the patrons of her party. Right? And that's how you end up with a politicized Oregon Department of Justice. That's how you end up with some cases getting prosecuted and some cases not. That's how you end up with unfairness in the government, because you can either have the rule of law, which treats everyone equally, or you have arbitrary rule. Those are the only two possibilities. Yeah. And what we see in Oregon is an increasingly arbitrary government and a culture of coercion that has been created to advance social engineering and the fads of the day. at the cost to the citizenry. So, of course, if you think your job is to advance your party's interests, then you're going to lead the lawyers and the 1,200 employees of the Oregon Department of Justice in that wrong direction. Every lawyer in Oregon government, almost every lawyer in Oregon government, reports to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General then provides legal services to the departments of Oregon government. In the military, it's very much like the way that we organize things in the military. We're all members of the JAG Corps.
Yeah.
We all report to the Judge Advocate General. In this case, in this day and age, Lieutenant General Flora Darpino, with whom I used to work. But we parsed out to all of the different assignments that military people have. When I sit down, when I'm assigned to U.S. European Command, and I sit down with one of my generals, one of the things that I always make that general understand in our first conversation is, ma'am, I'm not your personal attorney. I'm representing the unit. I'm representing the organization. So if you've just gotten into a car crash and drove away from it, you don't want to tell me. I'll hook you up with an attorney whose job it is to represent you personally. I represent the United States of America. Well, similarly, the lawyers that the Oregon Department of Justice provides and the legal professionals the Oregon Department of Justice provide to each one of our governmental departments should be made to understand and should be led by somebody who understands that my job is not to advance your political goals and ambitions. My job is to make sure that what you do is within the requirements of the law. Because if you think that the idea is to advance the political interests of person X, Y, or Z, then you're going to help them hide information. You're going to get involved, like the Oregon Department of Justice and Ellen Rosenblum got caught up in the Cover Oregon debacle when Governor Kitzhaber, when he dragged it over into his campaign apparatus and tried to keep it rolling through the election so that people didn't understand that it was falling apart. Well, the Attorney General got implicated in that scandal because she thought, well, my job is to advance Governor Kitzhaber's political agenda. We're both Democrats. That must be what my job is. But you have to have a little more integrity than that. And you have to know, as I often did when I worked throughout the military, when I worked in U.S. European Command, I was responsible for advising our command on counter-narco-terrorism and on, among other programs, and on our human intelligence program. And U.S. European Command at the time covered all of Russia. There were times when I needed to say to senior leaders, that is not legal. We can't do that. And you know, generals don't want to hear no, but you have to have the intestinal fortitude to say, sir, this is what the law says. Ma'am, we can't do this, and this is why. And they're always going to want to know why. And you've got to have a good reason. You can't just go out there and play it by ear. And so to answer the question, to get back to the original question, which was transparency, I think that you deliver transparency, and I'm going to deliver transparency, by understanding who you work for. Right? Ellen Rosenblum thinks she works for her party, the party's political patrons, and lastly, the people of Oregon. I mean, if she thinks that at all. My understanding of what my responsibility is I answer to the people. Well, I answer to the law, and the ultimate source of the law is the people. So I'm ultimately responsible to the people. And that's all I'm responsible to. That's how you have integrity in government.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you for coming on again. And maybe we'll do another one before we...
It's such a pleasure. I hope I talked more slowly this time. It's such a pleasure always coming and seeing you.
Thank you.